Go ahead and do introductions.
Mark Littlefield.
Karen Bronga,
Scott Myers. Christopher Constant.
Meg Zalatel, Mr. Martinez.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Okay, any other assembly members on the phone?
Felix Rivera, President.
All right, thank you, Mr. Rivera. And we're going to dive right in. We have, it doesn't look like a full agenda, but a couple of meaty topics. We're going to just move into these unfinished and new business are related. So continued discussion of the port plan of finance and then the new business TIFIA revenue bond NEPA processes. Mr. Falsey.
Thank you, Chair Zalatel. 3A is largely driven by whether the Port Commission ordinance passes at the next meeting, and so I think there's not too much more to say about that. We wanted to give you an update on TIFIA, revenue bond, and NEPA processes. I have some slides here. I promise I will try in the future to get them to you earlier. These all had to be changed as a result of a 4 a.m. email that we received this morning. So I will circulate these after the meeting. I'm hoping I have about 15 minutes here, and then some time for conversation and to get out of the way for the rest of the agenda.
Have you emailed them to Matt?
Not yet, and I will do
Can
that.
you, so that the members on the phone can see, at least follow along? Sorry.
Sure thing. Just a moment.
Thank you. And just what Mr. Falsey said, there's a Port Commission ordinance for public hearing and vote on Tuesday night regarding whether or not this surcharge would have to go back to the Port Commission if we change the amounts of revenue bonds that were issued. The idea is to eliminate that step because they've already approved the surcharge concept generally. And so it takes about 4 weeks out of the process and gives us the flexibility to issue revenue bonds based on kind of current information.
Okay, that message is sending, and I'll close my Outlook the moment it does and plug back into the screen. Okay, as soon as we're back up on the board, we'll dive in. Uh-oh, there we go. See my beautiful background. We'll try a picture of Kenai Lake. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so as mentioned, I think we're there. We wanted to bring the assembly into a discussion about the Port Infrastructure Development Program, or PIDP grant process, and the TIFIA loan process that we have been talking about, and how that triggers the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA document review process, and ultimately the scramble and the timelines that that is going to create. So the first story I want to talk about is our current application. On May 10th, we asked MARAD for a $102 million PIPD grant for Terminal 1 replacement. That would be the next grant in a series of grants. We have had some success with MARAD in the past. We've gotten a grant in 2019, in 2020, in 2022, and then one congressionally directed spending award that's attached to HUD in 2024. Now, folks who have lived through last spring are acutely aware that if we get that grant, that triggers a National Environmental Policy Review process. And so we have been very close to MARAD's Office of Environmental Compliance, which they call MAR 110.1. And they gave us a whole bunch of guidance documents, which I want to share with all of you, because part of this presentation is to be as candid and forward-looking as we can, as quickly as we can. If we get a grant, or if we submit a letter of interest for a Department of Transportation loan, which reads as TIFIA, that triggers the National Environmental Policy Review process. Until the NEPA review is completed, the guidance from MARAD is you can't do anything to alter the existing conditions of the site at all. So you can't turn any dirt, and you're also not supposed to limit the choice of reasonable alternatives for the project. And so that's the guidance document we get. When we actually get an award, this is what it looks like. They say, congratulations, 2022, you won an award. By the way, you absolutely must not do any construction, or if you do, you jeopardize the entire award that we just awarded to you. You might say, okay, no problem. This whole project is being permitted, right? So we are getting permits from NOAA Fisheries, from the Army Corps, from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and all of those have associated NEPA processes. So we have to already analyze the beluga whale impacts and the wetland impacts and the marine mammal impacts. Aren't we already going to be okay? Well, the answer is sort of maybe. And so the MARAD guidance is, if you're doing NEPA for somebody else in the federal family, MARAD still has to do it themselves. MARAD still has to make its own independent determinations. They might be able to pick up some of the analysis from the other agencies, but there's no guarantee. It depends is the answer they give us. And at the end of the day, they're ultimately going to have to make their own decision as to whether this was an environmental assessment triggering project that has no significant impacts, or if they need to do a full environmental impact statement with a record of decision that this is a fair alternative. In MARAD's defense, there is a little bit of their environmental analysis, which is beyond just the vector sum of the environmental analysis that we're doing for our permits. So we've got beluga whales and wetlands in the can, but we might not have social environmental justice in the can already. Okay. So when we get the grant, we're going to keep our fingers crossed, we get a new grant. What timeline does that trigger? Here we go. The grant documents, the guidance documents say, if we decide it's the environmental assessment, it's a year. If we decide it is a full environmental impact statement, it is 2 years. And what actually triggers was, we're going to assume that we're in the skinnier version, we're in the environmental assessment world. What gun goes off that starts the 1-year clock? And their guidance document says, the gun goes off if we decide that you really are an EA project, environmental assessment project, rather than an environmental impact statement project, and we have given you the award, and we have had a bunch of phone calls, and we have asked you for a whole bunch of information. And after we get all of the information that we want from you, sometime in the next 30 days, we will send you an email that says the 1-year clock has started. I think you probably are seeing where this is going. So what does that look like in our actual experience? When we got the award in 2019, we applied July 17th, 2019. We got the actual award November 6th. We started NEPA in February, and we got an environmental assessment in the can on April 29th, 2021. And the final decision, the finding of no significant impact, May 5th, 2021. That is longer than a year because they took the whole year window and the gun didn't go off for a while. That's the same story that we got with the next grant. We applied in September 16th, 2019. We got the award February 11th. Then those two got married. We did the NEPA together, I believe, February 2020. An environmental assessment, April 29th. Final decision, May 5th, 2021. And then everybody remembers how this process played out for the most recent grant. We applied for the $68.7 million on May 17th, 2022. We got our welcome aboard letter on October 28th, 2022. NEPA started December 2022, and it, with great public fanfare, didn't end until May 24th, 2024. And that crashed into the actual construction award. So as we have arrived and are looking down the pipeline, we say, hey, we submitted this grant application we asked for $102 million on May 10th. How's this going to work? When are we actually going to hear? Are we going to get an award sometime before the end of the next year? And if so, when do we actually start the NEPA review process? And how does it conclude? And on what timeline? And you know why I'm telling you this, because we are up against it. We have said that we're going to procure construction and open the bids next week. And then we're going to come to this Oversight Committee and talk to you about it on the 17th. And then we're going to do two significant things. The current plan is that we're going to award the contract, or we're going to get ask for assembly approval on the 25th, award the contract, and then tell the contractor to go start buying things on December 12th. That could come into conflict with a grant award. How might it not? Well, the contracts that we were potentially awarding all say that they're subject to whatever NEPA changes are required. So we think we have a story that says we have not overly tied our hands if we award the contract sometime after October 25th. And further, there is guidance that says you are allowed to buy long lead time items before the NEPA is really done, but only if you get MARAD's approval. So if we get a grant award on December 15th, and we have already given notice to proceed to buy the long lead items, we might be in a conflict. Hopefully that won't come to pass. Maybe we'll get great news from MARAD tomorrow, and then we'll quickly ask, can we tell the contractors to start buying things? And they will quickly say yes. But I'm flagging for you that I can't guarantee you that that is the way it's going to go. And of course, if we go over the waterfall and say, hey, go start buying things so that we are teed up for construction next summer, the potential consequence is we'll say, oh, we just announced that you were a recipient of a PIPD grant, but you plowed ahead too quickly, and now we're taking it back. Okay. So let's imagine though that we get through contract approval and we get through the long lead time procurement items. We want to tell the contractors to start turning dirt on July 7th, 2025. The big question is, if we get an award and that has triggered NEPA and we've got some free money coming to us, will the NEPA actually be done by then? Or are we going to find ourselves right back where we were in the Northern Extension project of having to decide, do we stall out and wait for the money to arrive? Or do we plow ahead and say the schedule is more important and we don't want to wait to accept that money? I know there's questions, but I'm getting pretty close to the end, I think. I also want to now pivot to the TIFIA loan process. There's been lots of discussion about how we're going to chase after the MARAD's TIFIA loan process, which will allow us to borrow money at under market rates. It is a complicated process. We are at sort of the beginning of it. We're at step 2 of this 11-step process. This is from the Build America Bureau guidance document. They also have a timeline that looks like this. We are about here. We have sent in a couple different versions of draft letters of interest and then a final letter of interest that we sent in on June 7th, 2023. We said we would love a big TIFIA loan. We think we qualify. And the good news was they came back to us on September 7th, 2023 and said, preliminary determination is it looks good. It looks like you got a qualifying project. That started off a series of conversations with MARAD now and with the Build America Bureau where they're saying, hey, if you do this, you got to pay our legal costs, get ready. We got to put in a $250,000 deposit. You got to front our financial issues. So it's going to be at some point $1.2 million to continue down this process. But recall from the guidance document that we earlier saw, when you submit a letter of interest to the Build America Bureau and say you want a TIFIA loan, that too triggers NEPA. So we're right back to the same place we were when we were telling you the story about the grant. And worse, a funny thing happened. So when we put in this application on May 10th, 2024, and we're in the midst of talking to the Bureau and MARAD about how we can get a TIFIA loan, they said, there's the same people are reviewing your grant application as who would be dealing with you on the TIFIA process. And much like no ex parte communication with the judge while they're reviewing your grant application, they just went radio silent. They just stopped working with us on the TIFIA process. So we didn't make a whole lot of forward progress. We had flagged it before our last update that, oh my gosh, we're not sure how this TIFIA story is going to work. But good news, we had a little bit of a breakthrough. What was that good news? Well, Ross Griswold and Alden Thurn, to their great credit, had said, we got to start meeting with these people. So there's been weekly meetings with the Washington, D.C. folks since July 2nd. And communications were ultimately restored. That was the good news that we got to say last time, is that they're willing to talk with us about the TIFIA process again as of last week or so. But that means that we're kicking the process off somewhat in earnest right now. At 4 a.m. this morning, we got from MARAD an email that said, please submit to us your purpose and need document and your independent utility analysis. I'm going to go slightly down the rabbit hole on independent utility, just so hopefully this is not something you never have to pay attention to, but because it could be a thing that you need to pay attention to, I'll tell you what that is. Remember when we were talking about NEPA, there are 2 paths. There is the environmental assessment path, which is 1 year, or the environmental impact statement path, which is 2 years or more. We have permitted all of the individual component projects of the PAMP with EAs. We have already had MARAD now say, but we need to do our own independent utility analysis. This is a court-created document that says, hey, If we are deciding as a court whether it should have been an environmental impact statement or an EA, we have to look at all connected actions and make sure you didn't chop a big project up into several smaller actions that individually weren't so environmentally impactful, but together were environmentally impactful. And so that's the first gate that we need to go through with MARAD. I think this is actually a little bit more of the same. So the MARAD is going to have to be reminded or convinced that this is several discrete projects. And we think that should be okay. We think that that should land well, but I'm flagging for you now because if we don't agree on that, then the timeline becomes much longer. By way of review, the half of the petroleum cement terminal got an environmental assessment. I think half of the Northern Extension project got an environmental assessment. And we are currently, with everybody else in the federal family, permitting the 2 cargo terminals together with a single environmental assessment. What seems to have caused a little bit of wire scrambling is that the letter of interest that we submitted to MARAD all the way back in 2023 said we'd love a loan for all components of this. And that might not be the right answer, and we might need to go, and that financially made great sense because every time you apply for a TIFIA loan, that's $1.5 million. Environmental permitting wise, it might not be the right answer because they might go, well, we're not actually sure how to give you a loan for bundled projects. So we're going to work that out and work pretty hard to try to get them back into this is an environmental assessment project. And we're having a kickoff meeting with them to discuss our purpose and need in independent utility next week. Again, the way it goes well is that they say, we agree, this is an EA, and then we develop a timeline that somehow ends up being consistent with this. But if we haven't yet even shot the gun to say the 1-year window has started, you see this punchline is the same punchline as the grant punchline. I think there are ways that we could get there. But if you ask me, can I guarantee you, can we get there? The answer is no, I cannot guarantee you that. All right, so what are our next steps? So we're going to continue to work with MARAD, but we're also inviting you into the discussion so you see what's coming ahead. We are meeting with the Port User Group October, and this is certainly going to be one of the things that we flag for them. And we know that we don't want to have a relationship with our congressional delegation that only involves calling them when we're in a moment of acute crisis. So as we are standing up a revised federal structure, we are going to read them into this as well. With that, those are the end of the slides. I think it would be good to get a sense from the Assembly of a preliminary sense of if there is a moment when the TIFIA or grant processes come into conflict with schedule, how we are to resolve that. We don't need to make any decisions now because, as I say, we still think there are ways that this could go well, and we'll have a much more concrete information for you after we open the bids and have our call with MARAD next week. By way of coming attraction, we wanted to make sure you saw this the way we were seeing it as well.
All right, well, thanks. So I have a couple of questions and then Mr. Constance in the queue. So one of my questions is, what does the intersection of revenue bonds have to play in this in terms of timing or providing us cushion? Yes, the PIPD loan or grant would be great. But we also know that the cost to delay is not only monetary costs, but it's opportunity costs and the chance of actually going forward. So is there any analysis so that we actually get in dollars and likelihood if we delay, how far we are delayed? And can we compare that against, the cost of issuing revenue bonds to kick off the first section, like all of these component pieces? Is that analysis? Because giving us timelines, I mean, frankly, this feels like I didn't care for this presentation. I'm just gonna be really honest. It feels a little bit like a scare tactic when we're otherwise not knowing that these, like we've been saying, we want to see this go forward. So I guess I want that further analysis. Like, what are the options on the table to keep us on schedule? Because I think we've been pretty clear about that. And when can we hear about what those are? Because right now we're scheduled for a special meeting at the end of October. Are we going or not? And I think that's the big question, so that we can make sure we're doing appropriate outreach with the public, stakeholders, et cetera. So there's not really a question. I guess it was a request. Chris?
Have you taken the time to do a breakdown of why the process took so long from 2022 to 2024.
You're referring to the Tiffy loan process?
No, I'm referring to the environmental process.
For the environmental process for the MARAD $68.7 million grant? No, we haven't looked in, I have not
So
personally
I
looked into
strongly
that.
recommend a deep dive into why that took so long, because it didn't need to take so long. That's my belief and understanding, and I have information I'll be happy to share with you about why. And I think some of that had to do with the failure of the administration to take advantage of real opportunities that were offered to streamline the process for lack of competence, for lack of a desire, for whatever reason, maybe just missed that email. And so I also don't buy too much into the scare tactics, because I think there's a vested interest in all parties to see this project get through, as witnessed by the fact that the Secretary of Transportation and everyone in their office, all the way on down, including both senators' offices, also our congressional office, were all on point and working hard to get this thing done. It would have been wise to do that a year before the crisis, because it could have been done a year before the crisis. And so to that end, I strongly recommend kind of a process debrief over how and why that happened the way it did. And then let's do some mitigation on the front end so that we don't find ourselves in a year chasing what should have taken a year, having another year to go.
I think all of those points are very well received. Of course, we are also acutely interested in getting all the free money and the cheap loans, and to make this NEPA process as quick and as painless as possible. I apologize if this landed as a scare topic. I think we absolutely can continue on the schedule that we are on. What we can't guarantee is that the schedule we were on will result in NEPA being in hand by the time we are ready to, for sure, go over the waterfall, which says, now this project is not actually going to be eligible for a TIFIA loan or for future grant opportunities, because that NEPA process is out of our time, out of our hands. We don't drive that. And so for certain, if there are lessons from the previous experience that we can harvest from you, we will happily do that.
Yeah, and just to the point that Meg is making, we could wait for the money to come forever.
Yep.
And not have a port. And so that's not really a viable option. Of course, I recognize you're looking at kind of contingencies and putting those before us so we understand the scenarios as they come forward and have fully briefed before we have to make tough decisions. But if we're always going to wait for someone else, then we may never have a port in that.
And to be clear, we are not recommending that we wait. I
I
am
know.
just saying that
Yeah.
there's a way that this does not break the way we want it to. And the revenue bonds option is in our control. And so
Right.
far as I know, we absolutely can execute on that.
And which is like obviously the least desirable option for the local community. You know, that's the last best option, and we will use it when we have to. So the idea is proceed, from my perspective, until we hit that point, but doing our best to mitigate the timelines.
Ms. Branca.
One of the, maybe like second or third slide, there was something about should, and it kind of seemed like you read it as a must, like we must not turn soil, where I think it said we should not. And so you're fairly certain, even though it says should, to me, should not means you probably shouldn't. And I would read that different than I mustn't. Anyway, I think I'm rambling, but that caught me as like, are we being overly cautious on this? Because that didn't look to me like you couldn't get going.
And through the chair to Member Bonga, yeah, that document was the welcome aboard grant award letter. I think the legal guidance is a little bit more prescriptive, but again, we're not actually changing course right now. We're not being overly cautious. I think we're trying to use the crystal ball as best we can to say, here's a scenario that could come to pass. So if there is room to negotiate with MARAD over whether turning dirt actually changes the outcome, certainly we would explore that. I imagine that was pretty well explored too in May of this year when we were looking at the $68.7 million in delay costs.
Yes, it was deeply explored. Do not turn dirt. My question is, can we move forward at the kickoff event with the NEPA asking what it would look like to ask for long lead permission for either NEPA being required? Can we just put that on the table next week and say, hey, either might require a NEPA, it might be an EA or an EIS. Can we get this long lead permission because we are knowing we're going to have long lead items?
Eric Adams, Jacobs Program Manager for the PAMP. Assembly Member Zalatel. Yes, we've developed a kickoff agenda. As Bill mentioned, we got an email this morning from at 4:30, and we will be discussing the long lead items and a number of items on that agenda. One caution I do want to make is that MARAD typically does not make any firm commitments in like this kickoff meeting, but we are pursuing every avenue to make sure that the city can go any which way they want to. So that's long lead items, potentially every option to make sure that the project stays on track.
And then I have one more question. I have the feeling I know the answer, but we just did NEPA on NES 1. Is there any way, right? I understand these are projects of independent utility. However, some of the information we provide in one NEPA is very relevant to what's going to happen in the other. Is there any opportunity? I know on DOT projects, we can get categorical exclusions based on prior work done. Can we explore any of those other items that shorten the timeline?
Thank you for the question. The whole cargo terminals cannot get a category exclusion for the program. But what we did do is basically, with the advice of MARAD, is they didn't want to see much of the documents change from the NES 1, and that document is completed. And we have actually, what spurred the 4 a.m. email this morning was we delivered it to them last night. And they came back and said, we're not even going to review this draft MARAD EA at this time that you submitted. And so does that answer your question there? The category exclusion would not work for the cargo terminals.
Okay, thanks.
And I think to do a quick follow-up, there is a pretty strong difference between the components of the project that already have NEPA in the can that are already done for TIFIA loan purposes. Like, so I think in a perfect world, there's no clash of timeline at all for NES 1 or petroleum cement terminal, because we just do the loan process. We do whatever NEPA process is required. Hopefully we just say we already did it when we did all the grants, ports over. The real trick is the cargo terminals, because there is no completed EA for the cargo terminals at all right now.
Yeah, and that was what I was really asking about. How much can we rely on the past work we've done? Because, well, right, because some of it's very similar in nature. And we know that, well, I know that on the DOT side, we're very much, when we do a bunch of the pre-work, there are other options to speed that environmental assessment along. Any other questions? Anyone online? Okay, well, I will follow up with my request in writing, and then we'll hopefully get that back. And I know we will see you next month, if not sooner. Thank you. All right, Ewu. So next on the agenda, we have AWU contract awards. These are 2 awards that are in our upcoming agenda for Tuesday night. I asked the utility if they would come and chat with us about them because they are both of substantial dollar amounts. So when they are set up and ready to go, we'll go ahead and hear from them.
Sure. My name's Brian Boss. I'm the Operations and Maintenance Director with the Anchorage Water Wastewater Utility. I'm here with Mark Schimsheimer. We're here to talk to you about a couple of items. The first thing is federal regulations associated with lead and copper limits in the nation's drinking water system. We wanted to summarize the requirements and then talk to you about a public involvement effort that's going to be addressing some of these regulations for a number of our customers. So we wanted to make you aware of it just in case you get any questions or things come up. On top of that, we thought we would take this opportunity to sit with you and address some of the items that are on the assembly agenda for the September 24th, that being the AWW Professional Services Term Contracts, sole source request for water rights, legal assistance, and the Project Management Office contract. Next slide, please. So regarding the lead copper rule, in 1991, the EPA adopted lead copper rule requirements. The initial intent of these regulations was to protect public health by minimizing lead copper levels in drinking water. Essentially, they wanted to eliminate that health effect as much as possible. The requirements were initially associated with monitoring. We had to do a testing program where we looked at specific lead limits and copper limits. We never found anything within our system that was even close to the limits that they were regulating to. So right now we sample once every 3 years to a specific set of our customer base. The rule's been revised many times over the past few years. These current revisions that we're addressing in 2024 are associated with the 2021 revision, which required specific steps to be taken regarding lead service connections specifically. One thing I'd like to make very clear is AWW does not believe that we have any lead service connections in the system. However, it's a federal regulation. We have to address it. We have to take these steps. So this is largely going to be a paperwork cleanup exercise for us. Next slide, please. So the image you can see on the right-hand side of the screen shows the different types of services within the lead copper rule revision requirements. So at the bottom of that image, you'll see plastic services. If you have a newer home, you might have plastic service that you'll see inside your house. We have primarily we have copper services within our system. That's the second screen. Galvanized iron is the next image, and that's kind of a dull gray material. We have a few galvanized iron in the system, and the top part of the screen is really the focal point of the lead copper rule revisions. They're looking for lead services specifically, which again, I'll say, we do not believe we have anything in the system that is lead services. The goals for the 2021 revisions were identification, public awareness, and removal of these services. The specific deadline we are driving towards right now is October 16th of this year. To meet these requirements, we have to have a lead service line inventory publicly available. So it basically has detailed information for every service we have available that people can look at and see whether or not they have these lead services. On top of that, we have to publicly post a lead service line replacement plan, which we are developing now, that talks about how we're trying to find these services, how we're eventually going to remove them from the system, and then basically additional requirements for going in, SOPs, standard operating procedures for as we're doing normal activity to test to make sure we don't have these services in the system. By November 15th, for any of the unknown services that we find out there, we have to start interacting with our customers to basically verify that there is no lead in the system. So we will be sending out that public notification between October 15th and November 15th to reach out to our customers. By 2024, we have to do certain things. We have to resolve all the unknowns in the inventory, and then we have to replace any lead services that we find. So next slide, please. The image on the right shows what a service connection looks like. So you see the car there and you see the house that's intended to be the surface. You can see the big picture of the water main. The service connection point of it is where the gooseneck starts and goes into the house. AWW owns and maintains the portion of the service that's in the public right of way. So between the water main and the property line, that's ours. That's what we own. Um, Private property owners own their portion of the service lane that's on their private property. So from the curb stop to the premise, that is owned by the property owner and maintained by the property owner. The federal regulations require that the utility address all of it. They don't, they're blind to who owns what. They just basically want the lead out of the system. So that is what we have to adhere to. What our challenge is, as I said, we don't believe we have any lead services in the system. It's really verifying the unknowns on property. As you can see at the data at the bottom of the screen, we know a lot about our system. We can verify that 94% of the Anchorage system is non-lead and 98% of the Girdwood system is non-lead. And we have very few unknowns on the AWW side. On the customer side, the unknowns are much higher. It's not that we don't have data that talks about what's on the customer side. It's just not in a database that's relatively easy to compile and put it into an inventory. So that's why I say our challenge over the next 10 years is going to be updating the database and verifying that these lead services are consistent with the AWW owned portion to the service. Next slide, please. So as I said, in 2024, we'll have an extensive public notification effort. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to have a website go live on October 16th on our AWW public website that specifically talks about the lead and copper rule. It will provide our customers with general information about the regulation. There's going to be a GIS mapping system where you could go to your property, you could find the data about your service. There's also going to be an interactive component of that where you'll be able to help us update that data to resolve those unknowns. You'll also be able to see the replacement plan for transparency. So you're going to be able to know what we're going to do and why and when we're going to try to do it. Between October 16th and November 15th, we'll be mailing out that postcard to our customers with the unknowns. You may get questions from that as assembly members. That's what that's all about, is it's really our first point where we're going to reach out to people and we're going to ask them to help us identify these unknowns. Next slide, please. So what does the future of the lead copper rule compliance look like for us? It's basically resolving those unknowns within the next 5 years. Is customers reach out to us if they can't help us identify that material, we're going to have to do some additional review of our records, and we may actually have to go out and physically test their service connection on property. So a lot of interaction with our customers. Within 10 years, any lead services that we find, which we don't anticipate to find any, we'll have to remove and replace those lead services. And we have to maintain the inventory indefinitely, so that website will be up throughout time. Next slide, please. So shifting gears, go ahead.
Actually, before you shift gears, can I make a request that you email us kind of what you're going to be putting out in the mail a little bit ahead of time? We go to community councils, we can help highlight folks taking, watching for their mail.
Yeah, we will
Okay,
do that.
thank you.
So, shifting gears to what's on the assembly agenda on the 24th. The first thing we wanted to talk about was our request for assembly approval of the professional services term contracts. On the agenda, this is AM 270-234. These are non-encumbering term contracts. They have a total not to exceed value of $10.1 million. That's a total of all the term contracts. What they are is they're 13 professional services term contracts. Each contract is valued about $750,000. And we will be issuing these term contracts, if approved, for a period of 3 years. Next slide, please. What the intent of these term contracts really do is they help our engineering division stay agile. They're not intended to replace staff. They're not intended to do major design work. In fact, the term contracts, when we authorize work for them, each task that we authorize is designed to be less than $100,000 for the day-to-day. The only time they get bigger than that one is when they're used to respond to emergencies, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So the majority of what the work looks like is as our engineering division is upgrading, say, a valve vault or doing an in-house design. If they need additional assistance from an expert, they can reach out to one of these competitively procured contracts and get that expertise to help them. So if they're doing piping in a valve vault and they see some corrosion, they can reach out to a corrosion engineer and get that assistance to do it. But it's minor work in the bigger project. Go ahead.
Yeah, since you have this chart up, I actually have a question. I mean, the build work is substantially less than the original value.
Yeah.
So why are we proposing such large contracts if historically our build work is so much less?
You don't know what you don't know. When we go and we seek approval of the term contracts, there's always a review of our capital program. We do about $30 to $40 million of work a year. We don't know exactly what we're going to be using these term contracts for because, like I said, they're minor work within a bigger scope, or they're used for emergency services. So it's a back and forth between us and purchasing on what we ask for. However, you are correct. When we actually go and we use these term contracts, the proposals is usually about half the amount. And then the build work, it's mostly time and materials work. So the build work is less than that. So they can be adjusted down.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can tell you, I mean, one of the reasons I asked for this to come here, I'm really uncomfortable with this item because it's $10 million over 3 years. It's also the consolidation of all the term contracts into a single item. At this point, I'm kind of a little bit worried about the amount compared to what's been proposed and billed historically, when you can come back and ask for amendments to these and it's a one meeting go. So I don't know. Part of this is to see if there's better ways that we can do this that kind of fit within our process, which is large dollar amounts typically go to public hearing, and these don't have to because they're not encumbering. But not encumbering at $10 million across 13 contractors is not something we typically approve. So I don't really know if I have a question. That's my concern.
And to try to help ease your concerns, the tasks that are issued on these term contracts, they're less than $100,000 a piece. The times they climb up over that $100,000 amount, that's when we have an emergency. So like when a water main breaks in front of the Abbott Fred Meyer, if we need an engineer to basically drop everything and help us that day and get that repair done, that's when they'll climb up over the $100,000 limit. But typically these are small tasks within bigger projects.
I'm trying to pull the item up quick. Does the item say that typically the tasks don't go over $100,000? That would be helpful for the public record. Like that
Sure.
would be really helpful context. And then Mr. Constant.
Yeah, thanks. This is a broader concern to the administration who's in the back of the room. The procurement code, these non-encumbering contracts have been used and really abused for the last 3 years as a way to completely skirt the procurement process, to keep secretly a set of books that say we've put away the amount of money that we need for this, but we're not showing you where it's coming from. We're not showing you where it's going to, but it will magically be spent. And then we will account for it somehow after the fact, avoiding all public process, avoiding all public hearings, avoiding really any clarity into the process at all or transparency. And so if you look at the title, did you bring the item up? Yes. So if you look at the title of the item, it is so dispositive of the problem. I'll pull it up right now. Yeah, it's mine's coming in. I won't get to the item, but I'll have the title. It's like one of the most mealy mouth information list titles I've ever seen. I have to
All
sort
right, the title, so it's item 10D2 on the agenda, award of non-encumbering contracts to multiple contractors to provide various professional services on a as-required basis for the MOA AWU not to exceed $10,100,000.
And so the title is supposed to be a pretty specific tool for the public to generally understand what's going on within that document. And of course, we don't get the item until after we've seen the draft agenda. So we only see the title, and you look at that title and you're like, $10 million to various contractors for some purposes, non-encumbering. And so this is not so much an AWU issue, it's an immuni issue that we have to sort through this process to make it more clear and transparent. We put forward a process to update our entire Title 20 or Title 7 procurement code, and for a number of reasons, resistance from the purchasing department, not allowing people with tons of experience to count their experience, so they weren't qualified. We were unable to get a review of this in the last administration. It was just not in their interest to see any clarity. And so we nit and picked, we chewed and bit at the little parts that we could manage. But we have a major problem here. If we can be asked to, and without much consideration, authorize $10 million of expenses without the kind of information you need to understand who we're spending, how we're spending in a very simple and clear way, we have a problem, Houston. And so it's probably not a top level problem in terms of must be fixed right now, but it's hard to be asked to authorize this kind of work much longer because we can't see into it, and it usurps the public out of it altogether. So that's my 2 cents on this.
Continuing with the presentation, these term contracts can be used by all departments. I've been with the utility about 22 years now. We've had the term contracts in place for the duration of that 22 years in some way, shape, or form. They pretty much mechanically work the same way ever since I've been here. And as I said, they do help the muni be agile to respond to the needs of the community when emergencies arise, or to continue large engineering projects by doing minor tasks within them. Next slide, please. Moving on, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Schimsheimer to talk about water rights legal assistance.
Good
Actually,
morning.
before you go on, I didn't realize we were switching items. So you said various departments. These aren't all just for AWU? I thought these were for AWU.
AWU manages them, but any department can use them with our coordination. So we've worked with PME in the past. They had a culvert replacement project under Northern Lights that they needed some emergency work from a trenchless technology expert. So they used the term contract there. We've worked with Parks and Rec. We work with the port to use these to also do minor
Okay.
components of bigger projects.
Thanks. So just a heads up to the administration, I'm going to ask for an A version of this, and I'll ask for the information because this looks like it's all AWU. And we need to make it much more clear that there's various departments. And when it says various accounts, I figured they were various accounts of AWUs, not PM&E or the port or otherwise that would cover the $10 million. That, knowing that alone helps ease some of my concerns, but I can't get it from the document. All right. Sorry about that, Mark.
Well, good morning, Mark Schimsheimer, Director of Engineering at AWU. I've got 2 topics here. The first one is the sole source request. All the next slide. There we go. Sole source request for legal assistance from Perkins Coie with regards to a water rights issue that has just emerged. We have an ongoing water rights issue on our Eklutna projects, and we also have some well issues, but those are not part of this sole source because we can see those in advance, and those will be RFPs for legal services. The reason that this is a $100,000 request of sole sourcing is that the DNR very recently, and we're talking within the last several weeks, has discovered that we may have a different situation with regards to water rights than we all thought we did. And it is a situation that might work in our best interest. So we are pursuing pursuing this in working with DNR. DNR has put us on a 30-day notice that they're going to be looking into this and making some decisions. And it's a first in time kind of water rights issue where we thought we were second in line, and it may be that we're first in line.
So I'm going to jump in here, Madam Chair, and just say, Joe, can we add this to the briefing on the 4th? Thank you. And I don't think we should get too far into the matter here. So
I agree, understand. I'm just saying this, you're going to see this next Tuesday night. And there's the reason for a sole source is the timely nature of the issue. We just found out about it and we have to take quick action.
we'll get a briefing in detail in an executive session on the 4th.
Okay, next slide. The project management or the program management contract. This is, again, by the way, open to all departments of the municipality. This is in response to the grant work that we've been doing. Right now, we are looking at about 130, 100 to $150 million of grants in the door for various different departments. The majority is for AWU, but we have other departments that are getting grants. We continue that work, and I can't predict what's going to happen, but if successful, I think we're going to be hitting the $300-400 million level within the next several years. In order for us to adhere to the federal standards, and one of them is NEPA, as you heard in the previous presentation, and in order to apply for these grants, which is a very arduous, labor-intensive process, and in order to execute the projects, we're looking for assistance. We have at AWU a project management section of about 16 to 18 people. We're having staffing issues, but even at full staffing, we have the capacity, as Brian has mentioned, to move between $30 to $40 million a year through our program. This grant program that we're in the middle of has the potential, well, it already has, will be running probably the $50 to $60 million a year level. And it'll have federal requirements, which again are fairly arduous as compared to the requirements that we have with our own money. At that level, we don't have the capacity to do the work. That's almost 200 times what we can possibly do. So we've looked at putting together, this is a non-encumbering quasi-term contract. We put it at 35 million in response to the money. Now, the way I come up with the number, because this is kind of important, 35 is a big number. When you do a project management, construction inspection, construction oversight, design review, bidding, applications, NEPA, a lot of those things you put together, they run around, industry standard puts you right around 12% of the project value. If you're doing 300 million, that's 36 million. So assuming that in 5 years we get 300 million to spend of federal grant dollars, then you're going to need around $35 million to move that money through the system and to execute the work. Again, we don't have the internal capacity to do that right now. So we went out on the street with an RFP, and hence Jacobs was the successful respondent. We had a very robust committee. We went through the interview process. They're a well-qualified local contractor here. They will hire exclusively local. This is not going to be something where money gets shipped out of state or even out of the city. Local hire is a very important part of this. And among the services that they're going to offer, and I don't know if I'm behind a couple of slides, grant assistance. We are running a little bit resource light on pursuing some of the grants, which we know are out there. So they're going to be helping with that aspect as well. Next slide. Oh, well, that was it.
Great. So we've got some questions for you, Ms. Brawley, and then myself, then Mr. Constant.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll go back and watch the recording what I missed. I understand the rationale behind needing contract. I do wonder, and thanks for mentioning that that would be Jacobs. I was wondering in general, at what point are we cannibalizing our collective ability as a community to build things when we have, as because we run into the bottleneck of we don't have enough people to do the work, as you said. Which I imagine includes construction, project management, the hard stuff and the soft stuff. So I guess that's a concern I have. And then also, I guess specific on the grants, I understand you guys are a utility and you're mostly doing hard projects, right? Like construction, physical stuff. I am worried about our lack of ability to go after more human services grants. And I also know that Jacobs, as a transportation, engineering firm, essentially has very high bill rates. So I just want to make sure, and I know that's not your problem to solve, AWUS, but I'm worried that we will be paying folks very high rates for professional work, and then we are not going to actually have capacity on our grant staff to go after things that's not their wheelhouse, and that often is less dollars per hour to go after. So anyway, I'm sharing these because I share the concern about the problems that you're trying to solve here, but also just worried about again, how do we actually execute on these things, and then we still have a big gap of other types of grants.
Let me address your comments because I'm not sure what the question is, but I do understand and mirror your concerns. We have, as a community, we are resource constrained in both professional services and in construction. And grant dollars coming into this community are going to challenge that situation. Jacobs has actually been bringing people up from the lower 48, moving them up because this contract will not tolerate, out of state people just coming up, hitting us and running away. So they are moving people up in response to a potential award of this. And then we get to the contracting community. We are all going to be running after the same contractors. I do expect the first round of this is going to be very painful. Prices will be bad. But as contractors see a solid, continuous cash flow, then we will see more contractors either organically come out of the community or move up here. And your concern actually was mirrored or was brought to me in a meeting with Senator Murkowski. She shared the same concern and said, "How are you going? I give you $1. How are you going to actually get this done?" And when I gave her this scenario, it was greeted with, "Oh, okay, there's a solution potentially." And then as regards to Jacobs does have capacity to do more. That's not completely what they're under contract for. So I can't speak to the other grant programs that may be impacted.
So I'm next in the queue. Appreciate the explanation. One of the things that really worried me in what you just said is Jacobs is moving people up here to work for them. Why can't we do some of this in-house then and just bring the talent in-house? I am not comfortable with this item at all. I can get over the other item. This one, I'm at a bit of a stopping point, partly the fund cert. I appreciate getting a non-encumbering fund cert. I know we don't necessarily have to have one, but various accounts, this 35 million is very amorphous. It doesn't exist right now, as far as I can tell. And it says the contract is not encumbering and appropriated funding sources will be identified prior to the issuance of purchase orders. I have a hard time giving authorization for $35 million of purchasing power when we don't know where the money's coming from, and for what feels like a little bit of nebulous work instead of on a project basis. And I understand the impetus to get the talent up here, but there's a tension here in giving appropriate public notice and ensuring that we are really tracking dollars where they go and how they come through. So right now, I'm not comfortable with this, and I don't know how I'm going to get comfortable with it by Tuesday night, but I can think a little bit more on it. And maybe we can talk a little bit more offline, knowing we're going to be running up against, it is actually now 12 o'clock. So I know Mr. Constance Q, real quick, anyone want to participate from the audience? Anyone? Anyone at all? Okay, we'll go 5 more minutes. Mr. Constant?
Thanks. Same line of reasoning. So it's $35 million over 5 years, or $7 million a year average. Non-encumbering, but it has to be found somewhere. And so we're being asked to authorize the expenditure of an unknown funding source that could hit just on average, $7 million that we have to figure out where that's going to come from. And so this is very, very challenging to anticipate and look at in this way, recognizing even 50% of it might be what actually happens in any given year, 3.5 million. It's still a huge chunk that has to come from somewhere. So I'm concerned again about this nebulous funding source. Mark.
Well, thank you for the question. So the funding for this will come from the federal grants that we expect to have, and the assembly will go through an assembly process. You will know where the money comes from for this. None of the money for this, other than the match, which is insufficient to do any of this work and would not start any of this work. All this money would be triggered only when federal grants show up. It's not 7 million a year of an operating budget that some utility has to carry. This has to be and is on the back of the $150 million that is in the pipeline that you haven't seen yet. And when it does show up, because part of it is a chicken and egg, I can't get it here until I get resources to help me get it here. But that's pretty light. That's what I'm doing right now. When 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 million, $100 million shows up here, it will go through the assembly. And then how will that money actually be put to work is via this contract.
So, yeah, just one second. I don't understand that though, because that's not what this says. This says something different, at least to
This
me.
is
in
creating
plain
an
English.
expectation to Jacobs that there's $35 million worth of work in 5 years, and we don't have any of that money. I guess that's kind of the concern I have.
Or it's
Where they're
coming from
going
our
to
pockets.
move people up here in response to a potential, like, and it may not be able to be solved in this moment. May have to be additional conversations. So the follow-up question is this a no-go thing for Tuesday night? Or if it was delayed 2 weeks, would there be some space to the October meeting?
There is 2 weeks of floating this, yes.
Okay. I think that probably might be the best course of action so we can hammer some of this stuff out. I hear what you're saying. I think we have tensions between our processes, and I think that's good. That shows growth and sophistication, and that we have to kind of look at how it all interplays, and that you have to address our concerns.
Absolutely understand that. 2 weeks does not impact this project one way or the other. And if we want to continue discussion either here or offline or any other forum, I'm all for it.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mark. So really quick, remaining on the agenda, legislative priorities for state legislative program. I've asked Mr. Falsey to think through, just because there's a monetary aspect to that, because it's usually money. Are they expecting to ask for any money for the port, and to let us know, because we're going to be working on putting the legislative program together. Of course, the same is true for other utilities. Are they going to be making any state requests? Budget items for 2024, I think we'll hold waiting to see what the proposed budget for enterprise and utilities are. We had some interesting moves last year, so we'll be on the lookout. But otherwise, we'll be watching to see what those are, and we can make room in the October meeting to take anything up. Anything else for the good of the order? Thank you very much for being here. Thank you to the port for being here. And with that, we'll be adjourned.